All right, images and tables in manuscripts. The first thing you want to do is review the target journal for the author guidelines of how to present images and tables. And you should try to find out from the client if there's any specifications for the expected number of tables and images. It's usually, 2 to 3 tables and a couple of images would be pretty standard for a manuscript, but it's important to find out if they're seeking any kind of number of those. Images, we're not graphic designers, so we can make suggestions only. So, as a suggestion, we might do a screenshot of another journal image that shows the exact pathway, for example, we're talking about, and that will be recreated by their creative department. Okay. You're not expected to do that as a medical writer. Just make suggestions, and then you would reference that. And then when it comes to copyright, it's perfectly fine to screenshot an image and stick it in your draft manuscript. And then it's up to the client, unless they're paying you extra to do it, it's up to the client to get the copyright information, to reference it properly, to adapt it. A lot of times images are adapted by their creative department. So that's all sort of in their hands. So don't worry if you're cutting and pasting an image because that won't be the final version. Tables in contrast to images. So it's possible to take a screenshot of a table from another journal. And in this case, as a medical writer, you should recreate that table and refer to the link where it comes from. And then they can adapt that as needed, or you can adapt that. So, but don't just screenshot a table and put it in there because it's not hard to recreate a table for us. Okay. And then for the rest of this video, I'm going to cover tables, figures, and non-tabular materials by reposting material from my AMA Style Mastery course, which is available for free at learnamastyle.com. Check that out if you haven't. It's all about editing based on AMA Manual of Style. It's very helpful for medical writers, so definitely take that. And then this section here covers tables, figures, non-tabular materials from an editor's perspective, but it will be helpful as you will need to recreate some of these materials. Moving on to the tables and figures section, and this is chapter 4 of the manual. Let's start with tables first of all. So you can see here that we have a few different subsections here, and we will cover those briefly. Not too much to it. I'm going to tell you the main points here and show you a couple of examples. The tables present detailed data effectively and are essential in scientific articles. Medical writers, we're not typically graphic designers, but we should know how to create a table. And then to edit a table, you need to know kind of the standard formatting for those. They're best used to display exact numerical values and allow complex item to item comparisons. They should support the text and be interpretable independently without an explanation in the text. Key components include title, columns, rows, footnotes, positioned near first mention in the text and numbered consecutively. So if you have 3 tables, you'll have table 1, table 2, and table 3 called out in the text. So we are all pretty familiar, but here is the title. Here is the column, one of the columns. And just as a point of interest, the data that you're comparing for a specific column should be right next to the column that you're comparing it to. So you wouldn't want this placebo column all the way over here, for example. So you want to think about that when you're structuring a table. So juxtaposed is what the manual calls it. Then you have your rows, and then you have your footnotes. Section 4.1.1 talks about the different types of tables. You have your basic table with your rows and columns, maybe styled with horizontal rules, boxes or white space. A matrix uses symbols, numbers, or shading to display comparisons, and they may appear as a figure instead of a table, depending on the complexity. And then boxes, sidebars, and other non-tabular material. We've actually got a separate lesson for that. They're used for emphasis or visual separation from the main text. All right, so this is an example of a matrix. You've got symbols. It's not numerical data that you're comparing. So that's an example of a matrix. 4.1.2, organizing information in tables. You want to arrange data logically. Most comparisons should be horizontal. And as I mentioned in that example, you want to use juxtaposition. Put the columns that you're comparing next to each other so that you can help the reader that way. And then you want to avoid excessive data. So try not to put too much in a table. Have more than one table if you can or if you need to. Be inclusive and specific in demographic reporting. We've covered that before in the style and usage section. Large tables should be split or presented in landscape or online supplementary format. 4.1.3 tables in online journals, and it just a little bit about image files and HTML tables that can be searchable, accessible, and allow links. So that just depends on the journal. So refer to the author guidelines for that. 4.1.4 table components. You want to have an object identifier such as table 1, and again, consecutively as referred to in the text. You want to have a title. These should be in a phrase style and specific and descriptive. And then include the word table and table number. Column headings, you want to use sentence case and boldface, and you want to include units after a comma, such as age, comma, year. And then you want to avoid inconsistent terms across tables. Continued, so the row headings, left justified, sentence case. Use indentation and shading for hierarchy, and then cut-in headings can organize long tables. We don't have an example of that. If you have patient baseline characteristics, you might have age, gender, ethnicity, and it will be separated out by subgroups, cut-in headings. 4.1.4.5 field, each cell holds one data point. Avoid blank cells or ellipses. Use NA with a footnote explanation. Align text flush left, do not justify. And then 4.1.4.6 merge cells. This is used to show data applying across multiple rows. You want to merge cells vertically for clarity when applicable. Table components continued. Totals must match the text and the abstract. That's something that an editor should check for. Boldface totals with discretion. JAMA journals generally avoid bolding. Alignment of data. Align horizontally by first line of the row stub. Align vertically by decimal point or left flush. So that's JAMA style. Let's go back to our table example. So these are all lined by left flush right here. And then rules or shading are added in production, not by the authors. JAMA generally prefers no shading or manually drawn rules in submissions. So just follow whatever author guidelines are necessary. Footnotes, you want to use superscript lowercase a through z, place them where they apply, title, column, entry. And these used to have a dagger symbol and double dagger and all of that. Now you just have A, B, and C. And you may find that you need to change that as an editor from what the author has done in the manuscript if you're editing. So here are some superscript numbers, A and B. And so those are going to be called out in the footnote here. So here we have A, B, and C. And you can see you also have the abbreviations, and that's a pretty standard footnote setup right there. Avoid using asterisks or symbols where possible, and then group and format efficiently if footnotes are long or numerous, so don't make it too overly complicated. 4.1.5 units of measure in tables, report conventional units, and the format you will have, for example, mean, and then in parentheses SD unit or median in parentheses IQR. So we have that in this table here. You can see standard error, and that's what's included in parentheses. 4.1.6 punctuation. You can have less strict rules for space saving as you would need. Virgules or forward slashes are allowed for dates in tables, whereas they're not in text. So for example, you could have this date, 4/6/25, you could have that with forward slashes, but you would write that out in the text, but in the table it's okay. Hyphens are used for ranges unless negative numbers are included. You would use 2. And if you go back to this table, you can see here that we have a negative here. And so we use the word "to" instead of a hyphen. Abbreviations abbreviate to save space, but avoid mixing spelled out and abbreviated terms. Define all non-unit abbreviations in the footnotes. And here's a prompt that you can use. And I believe this is included in the editing prompts. You can take a screenshot of a slide, for example, and instead of typing everything in, you can say, please spell out any acronyms in the attached image. It is such a time-saving move. Just if you don't try anything else, do try doing that. Okay, 4.1.8, numbers do not artificially equalize digits. So avoid 32.0% if 32% is correct. Round values to appropriate significant digits and express exact p-values. So avoid NS or thresholds like p is less than 0.05 if in fact the p-value is 0.003 or something. You want to always put the exact amount. 4.1.9, tables that contain online-only supplementary information may include lengthy or secondary data and must undergo peer review also if that's part of the article. It should be referenced in print and clearly labeled online. 4.1.10, guidelines for preparing and submitting tables. Use table functions in word processes. Do not use tabs or spaces. Avoid merged cells unless necessary for meaning. Don't submit as images or photos, so you want an actual table. Break long tables across pages or split into smaller tables, and of course, follow journal-specific formatting instructions. All right, that's it for tables. Chapter 4.2, figures from the tables and figures section. You can see here that there's not a lot of stuff to cover, and instead of going section by section, I've just kind of condensed everything for this because it's pretty straightforward. For statistical graphs, each type serves a specific purpose in displaying different kinds of data and relationships. Here are different types of graphs that you can use. You'll have data changing over time. You should use a line graph. Whereas if you're comparing groups, you should use bar graphs, either vertical or horizontal. So that's just the basics of data presentation, which is kind of outside the realm of being an editor. But if you see something that doesn't make sense to you as an editor, you should put a comment about it for sure. And then in general, pie charts are discouraged for scientific publications. You'll not see those much in the medical literature. Diagrams. This category includes flowcharts, decision trees, algorithms, pedigrees, Venn diagrams. And then maps are useful for demonstrating relationships or trends involving location or distance or study sampling methods. And here are listed some of the types of maps. And then illustrations are very useful for explaining physiologic mechanisms, clinical maneuvers, and surgical techniques. They can convey complex interactions effectively. Photographs and clinical imaging, they're used to display clinical findings, experimental results, clinical procedures, including radiographs, medical imaging, photomicrographs, and photographs of patients and specimens. Importantly, consent is required for publication of identifiable patients in a photograph, and digital manipulation of images should be done ethically. Of course, that's all on the researcher, not the editor, but some publications may require original images or disclosure of adjustment. Components of figures, you have scales for graphs. These include the range of values, and you want appropriate intervals and tick marks. Axis labels should include the type of data and units of measure using sentence style capitalization. Symbols, patterns, colors, and shading should be explained in the figure or legend and used consistently across figures in an article. Shading is preferred over patterns in bar charts. Error bars, you want to display variability in data. That's, of course, on the researcher and not you, but those should be in there. So it's worth a comment if anything like that is missing. And it should be defined in the legend or plot. Three-dimensional figures generally discouraged unless truly necessary because they can be confusing. Titles, legends, and labels. Titles should be brief, specific, and descriptive. So 10 to 15 words numbered consecutively. So, for example, figure 1 with major words capitalized in JAMA network journals. Titles should generally not begin by stating the figure type, except in specific cases like a hybrid graph. Legends, these should be written in sentence format below or next to the figure, providing sufficient detail for comprehension without excessive reference to the text. And they should include expansions of abbreviations and footnotes if needed. And then labels should be used within the figure to identify features and should be explained in the text. For placement, figures should be as close as possible to their first mention and cited consecutively by number, like tables, and avoid referring to figures by page position, such as in the image below. You wouldn't say that because you don't know where the image is going to show up in the final production. Copyright, for figures reproduced or adapted from other sources, written permission from the copyright holder is usually required. The original source should be acknowledged in the legend with a citation if the source is in the reference list. Journal author guidelines have specific requirements for submitting images, of course, so do follow those. All right, that's it for figures. And I will say that if you want to go to the manual, you can see good examples of all the different figures. So if you have a figure that you're editing, it might be worth just making sure that it's got all the features that these examples show. It's pretty extensive, you can see. All right. Finally, we have the non-tabular material. It's quite a short section. You can see here, it just really just is boxes and sidebars. That's it for non-tabular material. Boxes and sidebars, they do not contain cells of individual data. That's pretty much the definition there. And they're usually set off in the main text using elements like boxes, rules, shading, or other visual separators. Boxes contain words, phrases, or sentences, often in list form. They can allow for easier reading compared to prose, and they're used to emphasize key points, summarize information, and/or reduce the narrative text. They might be cited in the text following the citation rules for tables. You say box 1, or the box might not be explicitly called out. References appearing in non-tabular material is included in the reference list and numbered according to their order of appearance within the non-tabular material. And then sidebars are similar, but they contain supplementary information such as related topics or lists of sources for further reading. They're often not explicitly called out in the text, but are placed within the article in a logical location to enhance comprehension. All right, so that's boxes and sidebars, non-tabular material.